As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, Pokémon Stadium was very recently added to the lineup of Nintendo 64 games available on the Nintendo Switch Online service, and as a result, a lot of people who might never had any significant exposure to the first generation of Pokémon have had the chance to really enjoy the game, which is great to see, no way around that. Another nice aspect of this is the ability to play your friends online in Pokémon Stadium on official Nintendo hardware, and I understand that there's a little bit of novelty in that, and you never know, maybe for some people, this is your only way of doing Generation 1 battles with other people online. God forbid you get caught playing Pokémon Showdown on Mommy's MacBook that she needs for work. However, this re-release of Stadium comes with one unfortunate downside. There is absolutely no capability to transfer your own Pokémon into this version of Pokémon Stadium, and you can't create your own custom Pokémon within the game either. You are strictly limited to the rental Pokémon that the game provides, which can be a little bit of a frustrating limitation. If you're familiar with any Smogon format for Generation 1, or, giving Pokemon moves because you wanted to, you might be really put off by the limitations imposed by rental Pokemon. I mean, what, you didn't want to run Bide on your Tauros? What, you scared or something? Huh? Now, I would imagine that sooner or later, Nintendo are going to release the Game Boy Pokemon games on Nintendo Switch Online, and whenever they do, you'll probably be able to transfer your Pokemon to Pokemon Stadium, but for the time being, if you want to battle your friends in Pokemon Stadium on Nintendo Switch Online, you are stuck to rentals. So, instead of complaining about it, how about we make the most of it? Stadium Rentals is a real format, and people do play it. Well, to be real, there's actually a lot of formats. There are multiple different cups, and the rental Pokemon available for these cups actually vary a little bit, as do the rules. And on top of that, it's not even consistent across versions. The rental Pokemon available in the Japanese version of the game are completely different, and the Poké Cup is also gone, being replaced by 3 unique cups that represent official tournaments, Nintendo Cup 97, 98, and 99 respectively. Now, for the sake of this video, I will exclusively be focusing on the free-for-all format, where you can use the rental Pokemon available for Poké Cup. The reason I'm doing this is because it's the only way you can play a traditional 6v6 battle in Pokemon Stadium. Every other format is bring 6, choose 3. Now, one very important factor here that cannot be stressed enough is the fact that this is Pokemon Stadium, and Pokemon Stadium is mechanically very different from vanilla RBY, so if you're used to me talking about that, you might be a little bit out of the loop. Now, I won't go over all the changes that were made in Stadium, but I'll touch on some of the most important ones. If you want something a little bit more in depth, I would highly recommend Playground Karma's RBY Bites on Pokemon Stadium, or this excellent write-up that she did that I will link in the description. Both are brilliant, highly recommend checking either of them out. Of course, there's a lot of changes that also result from the rentals format in general, but I'll touch on that after I've talked about the changes in Stadium. First things first, Team Preview exists. Before the first turn of a battle has even commenced, you will know the opponent's 6 Pokemon, and they will know your 6 Pokemon. This might be unfortunate if you're the type who likes cheeky off-meta picks to surprise the opponent, but on the bright side, you'll know about the silly late game Zapdos that whatever you brought was probably going to lose to. Hyper Beam got absolutely fucking decimated. Whether you knock out the opponent with it or not, you will always be forced to deal with that recharge turn, even if you missed the Hyper Beam. It's effectively gone from a risky but incredibly rewarding powerful offensive tool to the completely dogshit move that you gaslight yourself into thinking is good when you're 7 years old. However, in its place, Double Edge has become sort of a mini Hyper Beam, as moves that inflict recoil damage to the user will no longer deal that recoil if they knock the opponent out. This is useful for Pokemon like Tauros, and of course, the same applies to Submission, so fighting types are eating a tiny bit for once. Substitute is massively buffed. It blocks all status-inducing moves, not just Poison and Confusion. Funnily enough, it also blocks HP draining moves like Mega Drain. Now, this is definitely the most controversial change that Stadium makes, but it's not super prevalent in rentals, not a ton of Pokemon get Substitute. Speaking of status, Burn and Paralysis have received several bug fixes relating to the debuffs to your attack and speed that come with them. For example, in vanilla RBY, if you use rest while burnt or paralyzed, you'll get rid of the status, but your debuffed stats will stay the same. This is fixed in Stadium, and I'm sure a lot of players will appreciate that. This catches a lot of new players off guard in RBY. Boosting your stats while burnt or paralyzed also does a lot of weird shit in vanilla RBY. You can use it to ignore your own stat drops or reapply the opponent's if they're burnt or paralyzed. Both of these are fixed in Pokémon Stadium. I have a feeling a lot of people will really appreciate this one. Sleep is heavily nerfed in Stadium, lasting 0 to 3 turns instead of 0 to 7. On top of that, Sleep Clause is present, but it's actually stricter than it is in the Smogon formats. For example, if you use Rest with a Pokemon, switch it out, bring in a new Pokemon, and the opponent tries to put that new Pokemon to sleep with a sleep-inducing move, it will actually fail because you already put one of your own Pokemon to sleep. It's very interesting. I think a lot of people will enjoy this change. Partial trapping moves like Wrap, Fire Spin, and Clamp are all nerfed in Stadium. In vanilla RBY, if you switch out while trapped, the Pokemon that comes in gets hit by the trapping move, and the loop begins all over again. But in Stadium, this actually cuts the opponent's turn off, so if they want to keep the loop going, they're going to have to outspeed you and hope that their move doesn't miss. So it's a lot less reliable than it is in vanilla RBY. Dig and Fly are no longer fucked up in Stadium. The glitch where they can make you permanently invincible if you get fully paralyzed while underground or in the air is fixed, and as a result, both moves are completely legal. So finally, your dreams of giving your Arcanine the shittiest coverage move ever can finally be a reality. And that's something. A Pokemon's critical hit rate is calculated differently in Stadium compared to vanilla RBY. To put it simply, if your base speed is 75 or lower, you are more likely to get a critical hit in Stadium, with Snorlax for example having a 10% crit rate rather than just under a 6% one. If your base speed is 76 or higher, your crit rate is lowered. For example, Tauros has an 18% crit rate in Stadium compared to around a 21.5% chance like it does in vanilla RBY. The infamous 1 in 256 glitch has been fixed in Pokémon Stadium. But unfortunately, due to the rather goofy way they went about fixing it, it has instead been replaced by the infinitely funnier 1 in 65,536 glitch. So, if you miss a 100% accurate move in Pokémon Stadium, I don't know dude, it's one of those days, maybe just go to bed, just try again tomorrow. Lastly, trying to force a draw with Explosion or Self-Destruct on your last Pokemon will always result in a loss in Pokémon Stadium. They've got a very no-nonsense approach to that shit, they're absolutely not for it. Now that mostly covers it for the important changes in Stadium, so if you want to hit people up and play some Stadium OU, you're good to go, and you could do that, it's a pretty cool metagame in its own right, but it's not the metagame we're focusing on today. We're here to talk about rentals, and rentals throws a few extra little wrenches into the mix that we gotta touch on real quick, so let's talk about that. For a start, one of the most defining aspects of rentals is the fact that every single Pokemon in the format has a fixed moveset of 4 moves that can never change. For the people out there who just find the crushing responsibility of having to come up with movesets for your Pokemon too much to handle, Stadium Rentals might be the metagame for you.
Ask your mom. I'm not very good with tough decisions.
We'll be closing in 2 minutes.
Combined with Team Preview, this means that both players can potentially know everything about their opponent's team before a single turn has even taken place, which is really interesting to think about. That's kind of bizarre when it comes to competitive Pokemon, really. Certain rental Pokemon feature some rather frowned upon moves that are even banned in Stadium Overused, such as evasion boosting moves like Minimize and one-hit KO moves like Guillotine. These Pokemon are completely legal in rentals, that's just how it is, so always keep that in mind. Unlike what you might be used to from official Smogon formats, rental Pokemon don't have their PP maxed out. This makes low PP moves like Fire Blast or Blizzard potentially really punishing if you don't use them correctly, so it's very much worth keeping in mind. Another thing that might seem a bit bizarre if you're used to official Smogon formats is the fact that rental Pokemon do not have their stats maxed out. They typically don't have max DVs or stat experience, which leads to an overall significantly frailer metagame. The way DVs and stat experience were handled in relation with rental Pokemon is actually very interesting. Not a single rental Pokemon has DVs that enter the double digits, let alone a perfect 15 across the board. The highest you'll see is a build of 76777, and this is typically reserved for first stage Pokemon with low base stats, like Pidgey, Rattata, and Abra. The same goes for stat experience. Out of a maximum of 65,535, the highest you'll see on a rental Pokemon is 27,200. One thing that's quite nice is that every single rental Pokemon has the same amount of stat experience in all 5 stats, which is just really handy for me. It means I can just use one number to represent stat experience on all these Pokemon. What I find really interesting though is that it seems like the distribution of DVs and stat experience was dictated less by any kind of perceived viability in these Pokemon, and more so based on base stat totals. Like, just as an example, all 3 members of RBY's Big 3, 3 Pokemon that even back then were known to be incredibly strong, have DVs of 22223 and 13,600 stat experience. Not good, but it's something. However, Pokemon that we know as weaker, that happen to have higher base stat totals, really got the short end of the stick. Pokemon like Exeggutor, Cloyster, Gyarados, and even fucking Arcanine have no DVs at all and 12,000 stat experience, which is pretty sad to see. The biggest losers here are Dragonite and the Legendary Birds, who have no DVs and only 9,600 stat experience. They are without a doubt the biggest losers, especially Dragonite, who has an absolutely atrocious move pool. This leads to some potentially unintuitive interactions, like Zapdos being outsped by both Haunter and Jinx, who have a lower base speed. It also means that the damage calculator isn't exactly ideal, so players like me who run crying and screaming to the damage calculator every time they feel a tiny bit threatened, I'm afraid we're out of luck, guys. And lastly, Pokémon Stadium Rentals features one absolutely heartbreaking change that I can completely understand you not being able to look past. Rental Pokémon don't have nicknames, and you can't give them nicknames, which drastically hurts the funny potential of the tier. I'm very sorry if you can't look past this, I totally get it, but it is what it is. So with all the mechanical stuff out the way, we can finally move on to the rental Pokemon themselves that make up the Stadium Rentals metagame. And rather than jumping into which Pokemon are the best or the most meta-defining right off the bat, I figured a fun way to go about this, because a lot of you will be familiar with RBY Overused, would be to talk about the 13 Pokemon that are ranked as overused in vanilla RBY, and talk about how they transfer over to Stadium Rentals, and how they're doing for themselves with their limited movesets. Starting off with the most iconic member of RBY's Big 3, Tauros, who got done pretty fucking dirty in Stadium Rentals, with a moveset of Double Edge, Fire Blast, Tail Whip, and Bide. Tauros in Rentals kind of plays like how someone would assume Tauros played in Overused if you had to describe Overused Tauros to them in 5 seconds. Against the tier's prominent rock types, you're really just hoping for a burn with Fire Blast, and it does very minimal damage to Gengar and Haunter. And let me tell you, doing minimal damage with Fire Blast is bad, because you've only got 5 of them. That being said, Tauros is still pretty good. A strong stab Double Edge on a fast, relatively bulky Pokemon is just that valuable, and it can one-hit KO some prominent threats like Chansey and Kadabra, thanks to the overall frailer metagame. One nice benefit of Tauros is that while generally its damage is slightly lower than Persian's damage comes from guaranteed crits, while Tauros's comes from it just being a fucking beefcake. As a result, Tauros still has the capacity to get random crits, and when it does, it's incredibly impactful. Compared to the Tauros we know and love, Rental Tauros might seem really limited, but make no mistake, it's still Tauros. It's one of the absolute best Pokemon in Rentals, and while Persian is pretty solidly the better late game cleaner, there is a lot to be said for running both. they make a terrifying duo. Snorlax is a bit of a weird Pokemon that I can see having a potentially massive impact, but I think is overall held back by the fast pace and high damage of the Rentals metagame. Snorlax has a bit of an oddball moveset of Mega Kick, Rock Slide, Metronome, and Rest, and out of the four, I think the move that stands out the most is Rest. Snorlax is pretty lucky to have this move. Only 4 Pokemon in Rentals have it, but I'm not sure it's that great of a user of the move. Snorlax's Mega Kick is a bit of a blessing and a curse. On one hand, with the exception of moves like Explosion and Self-Destruct, it is the second strongest physical attack in the format, only being beaten out by Raticate's Hyper Beam, which, you know, is a Stadium Hyper Beam, so not exactly ideal. Mega Kick can one-hit KO Pokemon like Chansey and Kadabra, while two-hit KOing very bulky Pokemon like Tauros and Zapdos. Unfortunately, while it's very powerful, having Mega Kick as your only stab option is a bit rough, especially on a Pokemon like Snorlax. The combination of Mega Kick's accuracy and Snorlax's terrible speed lead to a lot of situations where you're potentially taking 2 attacks before you can even do anything. And in a metagame as fast-paced and high damage as Rentals, that's pretty damn bad. Another huge issue with only having Mega Kick for stab is the fact that you've only got 5 of them, which massively hurts your potential to be a consistent threat throughout a game by using Rest to stay healthy. Snorlax in Rentals seems way less versatile than you might be used to from RBY Overused. If you're trying to use it, I think it's pretty much exclusively like a mid-game wall breaker. A Pokemon that just clicks Mega Kick and, with a bit of luck, will tear holes through the opponent's team. There are definitely more consistent options, but I can potentially see Snorlax being valuable, although I'm not completely sold on it. Chansey is one of the more difficult Pokemon to talk about in Rentals. On the surface, it seems just like the Chansey you'd know from RBYOU, but just kind of worse. It's still a special tank with recovery, but the special attacks it has are Thunder and Fire Blast, and instead of Soft-Boiled, it has Rest. Chansey not getting Soft-Boiled is kind of wild, but it really does show just how stingy they were with recovery in Rentals. It's kind of mad. Chansey is still great at taking special hits, but the overall lower bulk in Rentals and having to rely on Rest means it's not quite as good as you'd be used to. And weirdly enough, a lot of special attackers can kind of play around it. A lot of special attackers in Rentals end up with goofy physical attacks just because of how wacky the movesets are in Rentals. Like, they'd never pick these moves normally, but they're stuck with them. And thanks to them, they can kind of smack Chansey around a little bit. As an example, Exeggutor and Omastar can 2-hit KO Chansey with Egg Bomb and Submission respectively, Moltres can 3-hit KO it with Swift, and even fucking Alakazam can 4-hit KO Chansey with Tri-Attack of all things. However, Chansey does have a wild card in Rentals, and that's Minimize. Thanks to Minimize, Chansey can be, at worst, a decent special tank, and at best, the most infuriating fucking thing your opponent has ever played against. I don't really know what to say about it, really. If you're playing Rentals with someone, I could totally see having like a gentleman's rule to just not use Minimize Chansey, or not bring Chansey at all. Chansey's a very strange Pokemon in Rentals, and while I don't think it's anything that crazy, I could see it potentially being a bit of a problem. Starmie, unfortunately, just seems wholly unremarkable in Rentals. You will never see a serious Starmie in RBY Overused without Recover and Thunder Wave, and in Rentals, it lost them for the completely useless Swift and Harden. You do have Surf, which is good for stab, and Thunder, which is an okay coverage option, but that's kind of all Starmie really is. Starmie can't touch Exeggutor at all, who can threaten Paralysis or good damage with Mega Drain. Zapdos and Jolteon one-hit KO it with Thunderbolt, and while you can smack Chansey a little bit with Swift, I guess, it has over a 50% chance to one-hit KO with Thunder, so I wouldn't really take my chances. Also, just to rub salt in the wound, even though they have the same base speed, due to how DVs and stat experience were handled in Rentals, Persian outspeeds Starmie by a single point and threatens to 2-hit KO it with Slash, so yeah. Starmie isn't eating at all in Rentals, unfortunately. Despite getting hit pretty hard in terms of stats, make no mistake, Exeggutor is one of the best Pokemon in Rentals. Now, its moveset might seem a little weird. It's definitely very different to your traditional Eggy. It has Mega Drain, Egg Bomb, Leech Seed, and Stun Spore. The lack of Psychic or Sleep or Explosion might put you off, But this moveset works weirdly well in Rentals, being a bulky paralysis spreader with decent mixed attacking potential. Even with the stat nerfs, Exeggutor is very bulky for the Rentals metagame, and it's got some really good resistances to back that up, resisting important attacks like Thunderbolt and Psychic. I don't really have a ton to say about Exeggutor, but it's a great glue for teams, and one thing I'll say is that I cannot stress enough how useful Stun Spore is for it. Really, nothing like switching into Stun Spore at all. Even Pokemon that would give Eggy a hard time, like Gengar, really don't want to get paralyzed, so it means Eggy is surely going to get at least something done. Eggy is a great Pokemon in Rentals, and I won't blame you if you were put off by it when you saw its moveset for the first time, but I guarantee you, it is absolutely worth a shot. Alakazam is one of the most bizarre Pokemon in Rentals, with a notoriously awful moveset of Metronome, Tri-Attack, Disable, and Psybeam. Having to rely on Psybeam instead of Psychic for stab means that Alakazam's damage output is actually lower than both Kadabra's and Abra's. Although, speaking of Kadabra and Abra, the Alakazam line in general is in a pretty weird spot in Rentals where all three Pokemon in the evolution line actually have something going for them. Kadabra is without a doubt the best and most versatile of the three, possessing the strongest Psychic in the metagame, and notably, being one of only 2 Pokemon in Rentals with access to Recover. On top of that, it has good speed and pretty solid special bulk, and while it does have counter, which is potentially funny, you are unfortunately one-hit KO'd by 2 of the most prevalent normal type attacks in Rentals, Persian Slash and Tauros' Double Edge. Abra is a very well-equipped Pokemon in Rentals, with a basically perfect moveset that mirrors what it would run in RBY. Its very low base stats are compensated for somewhat by getting more DVs and stat experience than evolved Pokemon, which help it somewhat with its terrible bulk, allow it to do a little bit more damage than you'd expect with Psychic, and allow it to outspeed Pokemon that it otherwise wouldn't, like Jinx, Haunter, and even Zapdos. Outspeeding these Pokemon is really valuable because Abra is one of the fastest paralysis spreaders in all of Rentals. Now, while these are all great traits, there's no getting around the fact that Abra's stats are pretty damn bad. It is embarrassingly frail on the physical side, taking massive damage from even moderately powerful physical attacks like Exeggutor's Egg Bomb, which can do up to 95% without a crit. It's not like it takes special hits all that well either, so while I can see it being potentially valuable, I think you'd need a very good player to get the most out of it. Now, don't get me wrong, despite its awful moveset, Alakazam is not useless in Rentals. It shines as a late game cleaner, and while this is really the only thing Alakazam can do, it definitely does it better than Kadabra or Abra. The main thing Alakazam has going for it is that, unlike Kadabra, it not only outspeeds Persian, but isn't one-hit KO'd by Slash, while threatening a 2-hit KO in return with Psybeam. Another important thing that Alakazam has going for it is that, unlike Persian and Tauros, it is a late game cleaner that is not stopped by ghost types. Kadabra is a staple part of the Rentals metagame, and while Abra and Alakazam have some very obvious flaws, they are decent Pokemon in their own right that definitely deserve some experimentation. Now, while Alakazam managed to overcome its terrible moveset somewhat, we can't all be so lucky. Unfortunately, Rhydon got absolutely fucking nailed to the wall in Rentals, with a cataclysmic moveset of Dig, Strength, Thunder, and Surf. It is pretty much completely incapable of doing anything you would want a Rhydon to do, and is solidly one of the worst Pokemon in Rentals. And I'm sorry to say that Golem did not fare much better. Now, while Rhydon and Golem are unfortunately awful in Rentals, there might actually be some merit to having a Rock Ground type, mainly to completely shut down Jolteon, who is a very scary Pokemon in the mid-game. If this is a role you want fulfilled, you're gonna have to turn to Pokemon like Rhyhorn, Graveler, or Onix. And out of the three, I'd say Graveler is probably your best bet. Now, Graveler is not an amazing Pokemon in Rentals. It's painfully slow, gets worn down relatively fast, gets completely shit on by Exeggutor, doesn't have Rock Stab to hit Pokemon like Zapdos, but at the end of the day, it does serve a very important purpose, and if that's a purpose you want served, this might be your best bet. Despite being one of the 4 Pokemon to get its stats hit harder than anything else, Zapdos seems like a legitimately solid Pokemon in Rentals. Even with the stat nerfs, it's a relatively bulky Pokemon with solid speed, the strongest Thunderbolt in the format, and access to Thunder Wave, which is incredibly valuable. Now, while it is quite bulky and has consistent paralysis, it doesn't have quite the same defensive utility as Exeggutor because it's missing those valuable resistances. And unfortunately, unlike Exeggutor, or funnily enough, RBY Zapdos, it doesn't really have any mixed attacking potential. One of the most disappointing aspects of Zapdos in Rentals is the omission of Drill Peck for Sky Attack. Sky Attack is powerful, but unfortunately it's just kind of bad. It's way too easy to play around, and it's a shame that it has this instead of Drill Peck, because Drill Peck is a big part of what set Zapdos apart from other electric types in RBY. It allows it to deal with Pokemon like Exeggutor and Chansey, and in Rentals, it would have been able to 2-hit KO both those Pokemon with Drill Peck, but without it, it kind of struggles against them, unfortunately. Despite this, Zapdos is still solid in Rentals, and is absolutely worth your consideration. A Pokemon that might not be worth your consideration, and it pains me to say this because it's a Pokemon I quite like, is Cloyster. Cloyster did not make the transition to Rentals well at all. For a start, it features the same extra harsh stat nerfs as Exeggutor, but unlike Exeggutor, I don't think the tools it has really make up for it at all. The main thing Cloyster has going for it is Stab Ice Beam, and that is good, there's no way around it, but its rather just average special doesn't really do it a lot of favors. Yeah, you can 2-hit KO Zapdos, but you get outspared and 1-hit KO'd by Thunderbolt in return. Exeggutor can threaten Paralysis and a 2-hit KO with Mega Drain, while you're not even guaranteed to 2-hit KO it in return with Ice Beam. Clamp is interesting, but unfortunately the fast pace of the metagame and the nerfs it received in Stadium kinda hold it back in my opinion. You could potentially make Clamp work with a bit of luck and heavy Paralysis support, but I just really don't see it being worth it. And for the last two move slots, you've got the pretty much completely useless Spike Cannon and Supersonic, which are awful. Not having Explosion is huge for Cloyster. In RBY, it's a Pokemon that is great at slowly chipping you down over the course of a game, and Explosion is really valuable to add some scare factor and potentially finish off Pokemon that it otherwise wouldn't really be able to handle, and that's just gone in Rentals. Cloyster could maybe have a small niche. It does have Ice Beam and good physical bulk, but what's here just doesn't seem like enough. Jynx is a bit of a strange Pokemon because it's a Pokemon that didn't really transfer over to Stadium very well in general because of the sleep nerfs, but it seems to have done quite well for itself in Rentals. Jynx has a pretty solid moveset that is fairly reminiscent of your traditional RBY Overused Jynx, although unfortunately, losing Blizzard for Ice Punch is a real shame. Thanks to this, you don't have a guaranteed 2-hit KO on Exeggutor or Zapdos, and that really does suck. Still, having Psychic is fantastic. It has great damage, solid neutral coverage, and 2-hit KOs both of the ghost types in the tier, which is really important. Even with the nerfs to sleep, Lovely Kiss is by no means useless. It's one of the more consistent forms of sleep in the metagame, and at the end of the day, even just 1 or 2 turns of sleep can be enough to change the course of a game. Mega Punch is just filler really, but to be fair, the 4th move on Jynx was never really that big of a deal. And at the very least, it does 3-hit KO Kadabra, which, if nothing else, is kind of funny. We should consider ourselves lucky that Jynx learns Mega Punch in Rentals and not Mega Kick, however, because for some fucking reason, making Jynx use Mega Kick in Pokémon Stadium reveals that it has fully textured human feet. They only appear during the Mega Kick animation, and I hate it. Despite not really caring for the Stadium mechanics and missing out on Blizzard, Jynx seems like a legitimately solid Pokemon in Rentals. It's got good coverage, decent damage, and while its base stats are low, the DVs help make up for that somewhat. I'm very happy to report that Gengar is without a doubt one of the biggest winners in Rentals. With a moveset of Thunderbolt, Nightshade, Hypnosis, and Confuse Ray, it's eerily similar to your traditional RBY Overused Gengar, although losing Explosion for Confuse Ray isn't really ideal. Gengar serves an extremely important role by being one of the absolute best answers to the late game normals. Tauros' Fire Blast can be a little scary with the burn chance, but luckily Persian's Bubble Beam does practically nothing to you. And speaking of special attacks, Gengar actually has the 2nd highest special stat in the format. This not only makes it a good answer to a lot of special attackers, but gives it a deceptively powerful Thunderbolt that even has a small chance to 2-hit KO Persian. Obviously Gengar is still very afraid of Earthquake and Psychic, but thanks to the more limited distribution of these moves, it doesn't have to tread quite as carefully as it does in RBY Overused. Although, funnily enough, one user of Psychic it does have to watch out for is Haunter, who can actually potentially 2-hit KO it with the move. Haunter is not only a decent answer to Gengar, but it's a phenomenal Pokemon in its own right, and serves as legitimate competition, and even a potentially great partner for Gengar. Its stats are a little lower, but the extra DVs and stat experience do make up for that a little bit. Its Psychic isn't quite as strong as Gengar's Thunderbolt, but it's still a powerful move in its own right, still being able to 3-hit KO Tauros for example, and the threat of special drops is very real. Mega Drain is a potentially very valuable tool as it does 90% minimum to Graveler, who Gengar can't really do a whole lot to. I think what really sets Haunter apart from Gengar though is Explosion. Having this is fantastic as it just allows you to blow past some Pokemon that Gengar doesn't like dealing with. For example, you 1-hit KO both Kadabra and Chansey, and obviously you do a huge chunk to other Pokemon that Gengar doesn't really care for, specifically Exeggutor. Gengar and Haunter are two of the absolute best Pokemon in rentals. I would always recommend running at least one of them, and there is a legitimate argument to run both. They are two of the biggest winners here, and you absolutely love to see it. Jolteon is an incredibly simple Pokemon that is nonetheless very important in the rentals metagame and is doing very well for itself. It's tied with Aerodactyl for the second fastest mon in the format. Thunderbolt hits incredibly hard, and Pin Missile means that it's not completely helpless versus the likes of Eggy or Kadabra. Well, actually, if you're using it versus Kadabra, that's a little bit silly, but it is very fun. There's really not a lot to Jolteon, but it's just very good at what it does. If you don't have something like a Graveler to completely shut it down, it is phenomenal at breaking holes in the opponent's team to soften it up for the likes of Persian and Tauros in the late game. It's a great, very easy to use Pokemon that I would highly recommend. On the other end of the not a whole lot to say spectrum, we've got Slowbro, who unfortunately seems kind of ass. Surf and Psychic are very tempting, but unfortunately you've lost Thunderwave and Amnesia for the borderline useless Disable and Withdraw. It cannot be stressed enough just how integral Thunderwave and Amnesia are to what Slowbro does in RBY Overused. They allow it to actually scare Pokemon out and become, actually scary thanks to the stat boost from Amnesia. Without that, all you've got is a pathetically slow, kind of bulky special attacker with just fairly average damage. If you are absolutely desperate for the traditional Toby Bro experience, then Slowpoke does actually have Amnesia and Thunder Wave, but I'm pretty sure it's just way too weak to get anything done. I don't think it's worthwhile. So that covers it for a, hopefully, quick recap of how all the RBY Overused Pokemon transitioned over to the Rentals metagame. There's some definite winners, some definite losers, some Pokemon that I could maybe see being a little bit better or worse than anticipated, but we're not quite done just yet. Obviously, there are more than 13 rental Pokemon, and we're not going to take a look at every rental Pokemon, that would be pretty redundant, but it's only fair that we look at some of the biggest winners who weren't a part of RBY Overused, or at least not a consistent part of it. Starting with a Pokemon that I've mentioned a lot so far. Persian is a serious contender for the absolute best Pokemon in rentals, and it's not super hard to see why. While its base stats aren't amazing, that means it gets a bump to its DVs and stat experience, and it has an incredible speed tier. Slash is an incredible move that 2-hit KOs a ridiculous number of Pokemon, and you do have some ability to play around Pokemon that you can't beat with Slash. Bubble Beam is a concrete 1-hit KO on any of the rock ground types your opponent could potentially use, and while the Ghosts are great answers to Persian, you can play around them a tiny bit. This is a little bit out there, but if you predict a switch to Gengar or Haunter as Persian, you can use Mimic, and if you get lucky and copy either Nightshade from Gengar or Psychic from Haunter, you can 3-hit KO the Pokemon you stole it from, which is, if nothing else, extremely cool. Persian is definitely best saved for the late game where it can clean up weakened opponents, but that's not due to any fault of Persian, it's just that it's such a valuable Pokemon that you really do want to protect it from stray hits and status throughout a game. Persian is amazing in rentals, and honestly, it's probably a mandatory addition to your team. I'm shocked to say that Aerodactyl is a surprise winner in rentals, which really caught me off guard considering its history in RBY. Aerodactyl's moveset looks kind of awful, consisting of Fly, Hyper Beam, Dragon Rage, and Supersonic, but it works surprisingly well. Aerodactyl is tied for the second fastest Pokemon in the metagame with Jolteon, and because you outspeed so many Pokemon, if you use Fly, you're typically gonna go before your opponent, which will make whatever they went for miss. Now obviously they have the option of switching out to something that would be better at taking Fly, but that's the thing. Not a lot of Pokemon really switch into Fly that well, and the ones that do typically can't really handle Aerodactyl that well. Graveler seems like a good switch in, like obviously it resists Fly, but due to its lack of Rock Stab, it can't really hit Aerodactyl for much in return, and in this scenario, Aerodactyl has another useful move, believe it or not, being Dragon Rage. Dragon Rage is notoriously kinda terrible in RBY, but you gotta remember, here all the Pokemon are level 50, which means that Dragon Rage is essentially just a slightly weaker Seismic Toss or Nightshade. It's a 4-hit KO on most Pokemon in the metagame, which is pretty handy. Another fairly nice thing about Aerodactyl is its 20% critical hit rate, which can make switching into Fly even more of a scary prospect. Also, while I've talked about how this move is heavily nerfed in Stadium, Hyper Beam still has a little bit of value as Aerodactyl's definitive strongest attack. It might be worth using in last turn scenarios or securing an important KO on a Pokemon you otherwise wouldn't be able to knock out. To be fair, there are some Pokemon that can handle Aerodactyl pretty solidly, like Omastar and Kabutops not only can switch into Fly, but hit it hard with Surf. However, Aerodactyl is overall just very interestingly good. Aerodactyl's a strange Pokemon. I could see it being really good, or falling off over time as people learn to play around it. It's one of the most interesting Pokemon in Rentals for sure, but at the very least, it's cool to see it have at least some presence. Articuno and Moltres just kinda seem like big special attack beatstick Pokemon, and while they're pretty good at that, I wanted to talk about them because I think they've also got some potential as two of the best Pokemon in the format with access to Substitute, which, bear in mind, is the buffed Stadium Substitute. Even with the same nerfs to their stats as Zapdos, Articuno and Moltres both hit incredibly hard. Articuno's Ice Beam and especially Moltres' Fire Blast are a 2-hit KO on a ton of Pokemon. However, a move that I thought was pretty useless on Zapdos that I could maybe see Articuno getting some use out of is Sky Attack, and that's mainly thanks to the fact that it also has Substitute, so it could be safe during the charge turn. Now, even if you are behind a sub, 2-turn moves are historically very flimsy, but the power of Sky Attack is very hard to pass up. It's one of the few attacks in the format that can outright 1-hit KO Exeggutor, which is no laughing matter. As for Moltres, it gets Fly instead of Sky Attack, and while that's less reliant on Substitute to make work, I think it might be worse overall. Moltres is much worse speed than Aerodactyl, in my opinion makes it a much worse user of the move, but it could still be decent, I guess. Overall, I think both of these Pokemon are pretty interesting. I can see them bullying new players pretty hard just because of their very solid bulk and immensely powerful special attacks, but they're pretty simple overall and probably quite easy to play around, although I do have hope that Substitute could be quite useful. I'm not totally sold on either of them, but I definitely see potential, especially in Articuno, who I would say is definitely the better of the two. Omastar is a really interesting Pokemon. It can answer the likes of Persian and Tauros, and while it's not as consistent of an answer as the Ghosts, it makes up for that by being uniquely good in a bunch of other weird matchups. Thanks to its good bulk, unique typing, and access to a very powerful Hydro Pump, Omastar shuts down a lot of Pokemon such as Snorlax, Articuno, Moltres, and Aerodactyl. It's not the most concrete check in the world to a lot of these Pokemon, but the fact that it has such a powerful stab in Hydro Pump kinda makes up for that because it's a lot more immediately threatening. Generally it loses to the Ghosts and the Electric types, but none of them really like switching into Hydro Pump. Even with their good special bulk, Pokemon like Haunter are 2-hit KO'd. Omastar does have some serious issues though. It is completely and utterly helpless against Exeggutor, and while Hydro Pump is powerful, it's not super accurate and you've only got 5 of them. I already mentioned with Snorlax how being very slow and having an inaccurate stab can really come back to bite you, and that's definitely an issue for Omastar. It's a very interesting Pokemon with a lot going for it, but it's got some tough matchups and is overall a little bit inconsistent, although I can absolutely see the potential here. Raticate is a weaker late game normal type compared to Persian or Tauros, but it also doubles as the world's goofiest setup sweeper. Raticate has access to Focus Energy, which actually works in Pokémon Stadium, and after a Focus Energy, your crit rate gets boosted to 65%, which, if you're brave enough, is basically 100%. On a critical hit, every single Pokemon in the format that doesn't resist normal is 2 hit KO'd by Hyper Fang and 1 hit KO'd by Hyper Beam, with the unfortunate exception of Snorlax. On a critical hit, you can even 1-hit KO Aerodactyl with Thunder, although unfortunately you can't 1-hit KO Omastar, and you're obviously kinda boned versus Graveler. Raticate has the potential to be very rewarding, and more importantly, very funny. Although unfortunately, if it can't get set up or just gets a little bit unlucky, it kind of falls flat and is just an okay late game cleaner. To wrap things up, there is one more Pokemon I want to talk about. And it's not an amazing Pokemon or anything, but just the fact that this Pokemon has a shot in Rentals is so fucking cool to me. I want to talk about Paris. Not Parasect, but just regular old Paris. You might think I'm joking, but Paris actually has quite a lot going for it. Obviously its stats are pretty bad, but because they're bad, it gets a lot of help from extra DVs and stat experience. And they're good enough to not, like, just instantly die. Even powerful attacks like a Persian Slash only do around 60% to it. It's not like instantly getting 1-hit KO'd or anything. On top of that, its weaknesses are relatively rare, and it's got some valuable resistances like Thunderbolt and Earthquake. The defining feature of Paris is definitely Spore. Now, I have talked about how Sleep was nerfed, but because it's a slow sleep, you're guaranteed to get at least one free turn out of it, because Paris is almost always going to be going last, and since you can act on the turn you wake up in Generation 1, you get at least one turn of the opponent not being able to move. Paris' damage output is also weirdly kind of alright. It does have access to Slash, and while it doesn't have the same 99% chance to crit that Persian does thanks to its awful base speed, the odds are still in your favour. You've got like a 78% chance. Well, you do if I've done the math right. I'm pretty sure it's 78. I could be wrong on that, I hope I'm not. But either way, if the odds are in your favour, on a critical hit, Slash can 4-hit KO Exeggutor and 3-hit KO Tauros, which is legitimately decent. Also, while it can't really hit the Ghosts, unless they just, you know, decide to get hit by Dig for some reason, the Ghosts can't really hit Paris for all that much in return, and it does at the very least threaten them with Sleep, as long as nothing else on the opponent's team is asleep. Paris is a very cool Pokemon in Rentals, but obviously the stats do hold it back. It's painfully slow and not that bulky, so there's a very real chance of Paris just taking a hit, putting something to sleep for one turn, landing a Slash, and then just kind of dying. Paris is flawed, but it's very, very cool, and I love that it can do something in Rentals. So that does it for everything I wanted to talk about in relation to the Pokémon Stadium Rentals metagame. Obviously, this is not all there is to the metagame. There are other Pokemon that have undeniably good traits but just don't really seem up to snuff, and others that seem legitimately decent but I just didn't really mention because they didn't seem all that interesting. Originally I wanted to end this out by like maybe recommending a couple rental teams, but like, I don't think there's really a need. I think the best thing I can do is just tell you to go play this metagame, because it's not only stupidly fun, but incredibly accessible. Team building is incredibly fast because of the fixed movesets, and if you don't have like the Nintendo Switch Online thing, you can very easily play this on Pokemon Showdown, because all of the rental Pokemon movesets are available on Smogon, ready for you to just copy-paste straight into the Stadium overused team builder. Stadium Rentals is just kind of awesome. It's fast, it's fun, and more than anything, it's got a ton of room to grow. I mean, who knows, with the fixed movesets, there's a chance maybe one day this metagame will just be solved. Like, there's a fixed team of 6 Pokemon that you would always want to run, but until then, I highly recommend giving this metagame a shot. It is a hidden gem in the first generation of Pokemon.